It was a day that should have been perfect. Isabella had spent months waiting for a response from the university, and that day, her dream finally came true. She had been accepted into law school. The 18-year-old couldn't have been more excited. After so many sleepless nights, studying tirelessly, her hard work had paid off. The future shone brightly before her, full of possibilities. She decided to celebrate by driving around the city in her father's car, a shiny black SUV with silver details that always made her feel safe and proud. Her father, Miguel, was the police commander in the city, a respected and well-known figure. The car not only represented her father's position but also everything he had achieved as a black man in an institution dominated by white men. Isabella, behind the wheel, felt that legacy of struggle and success. As she drove down the quiet streets, with the windows open, music at the perfect volume, her heart beat with a mix of freedom and pride. It all felt like a dream come true. The sun was shining high in the sky, and the fresh air brushed against her face. She was on her way to meet some friends to share the news of her acceptance and celebrate the great achievement that would change her life forever. The clear sky seemed like a sign that fate was smiling on her, but as she neared one of the main avenues, the flashing red and blue lights in the rearview mirror shattered the calm. A police car was following her. Isabella felt a pang of anxiety in her chest. She looked around, wondering if she had unknowingly committed some infraction. She drove cautiously, obeying every sign, and couldn't imagine why she was being stopped. But the lights persisted, and the sound of the siren broke the air, making it clear that she was being forced to pull over. With a mix of disbelief and nervousness, Isabella guided the SUV to the side of the road. As she turned off the engine, her mind raced, trying to find an explanation. Everything was in order, her documents, the car, nothing seemed out of place. So why had she been stopped? Her heart pounded as she watched through the rearview mirror as a police officer got out of the patrol car and walked toward her. He was a tall, stocky white man with a stern expression. His uniform, immaculate and gleaming in the sunlight, contrasted with the coldness in his gaze. He walked with the authority of someone used to imposing his will without question. When he reached the driver's window, Isabella noticed something in his demeanor, something she had seen before in other faces, something that immediately put her on alert. Without a greeting, without the courtesy one would expect from a police officer, he simply extended his hand toward her with an implicit demand for her documents. "Give me your license and the car's registration." His tone wasn't aggressive, but there was a firmness in his voice that made it clear he wouldn't tolerate questions. Isabella, feeling a wave of discomfort, obeyed immediately. With slow, controlled movements, she opened the glove compartment to retrieve the vehicle's documents and handed them over, along with her driver's license. She knew that the best course of action in situations like this was not to resist, to be cooperative, even though the situation already felt strange and unjust. As the officer reviewed the papers, the silence between them grew heavier, more uncomfortable. The officer, whose name, according to the badge on his uniform, was David, scrutinized the documents as if expecting to find something incriminating in them. After what felt like an eternity, he looked up and fixed his gaze on Isabella. The way he looked at her gave her an unsettling feeling that she couldn't shake. It was a look full of judgment, as if he had already condemned her without knowing her. "This car doesn't seem like it's yours," he finally stated, his voice full of unjustified suspicion. "We've had reports of cars like this being stolen in this area. What are you doing driving a car like this?" The question hit Isabella like a punch to the chest. It wasn't a casual question, it was an accusation disguised as doubt. She knew exactly what was happening. Her mind flashed back to years earlier when her father had warned her about situations like this, about the latent racism in society, even when it seemed like things had changed. She knew this man wasn't seeing a young woman celebrating her university acceptance. No, all he saw was a young black woman driving a luxury car. That was all that mattered to him in that moment. With her voice steady, but controlling the anger that was beginning to build inside her, Isabella responded. "This car belongs to my father. He's Commander Miguel, chief of police in this city. If you check the documents, you'll see everything is in order." She hoped that mentioning her father, a figure of authority within the same police department, would be enough for the officer to reconsider what he was doing. But instead of a look of surprise or respect, what she saw on David's face was something entirely different, a barely noticeable smile. "Sure, sure," he said with a sarcastic laugh. "Step out of the car." Isabella's heart sank. Step out of the car. Seriously? She felt indignation beginning to bubble inside her, but she also knew she didn't have many options. In situations like this, the worst thing she could do was resist. Despite how absurd and unjust it was, she decided to comply. Slowly, she opened the car door and stepped out, keeping her hands visible so the officer wouldn't have any excuse to act more aggressively. David took a step back, scrutinizing her every move with a watchful gaze. He walked around the vehicle, inspecting the license plates and peeking through the windows as if searching for evidence of a crime. With every passing second, the humiliation sank deeper into Isabella's soul. She wasn't just being treated like a criminal for something she hadn't done, but the most important day of her life was being tainted by this prejudiced encounter. "I'm calling for backup," David said as he stepped aside to radio in. "It won't take long." The words echoed in Isabella's ears like a sentence. She knew this was about to get worse. Isabella stood next to her car, the sun beating down mercilessly on her skin, feeling how the day that was supposed to be a celebration of her personal achievement was unraveling before her eyes. The warm breeze that had brushed her face minutes earlier, while she drove with music vibrating through the car, had turned stifling. Every second felt like an eternity. Passers-by on the avenue glanced at her from the corner of their eyes, some with curiosity, others with a mix of pity or judgment, as if her mere presence next to the officer was enough to assume she had done something wrong. Isabella, an 18-year-old black girl, was being judged again, not for her actions, but for her appearance. Her father's words echoed in her mind, those uncomfortable conversations she had always hated, but knew were necessary. For as long as she could remember, Miguel had warned her that, as a black woman, she would have to work twice as hard to receive half the recognition that others would get. It wasn't fair, but it was the reality. And most importantly, he had taught her how to remain calm in situations like this, how to act with composure in the face of injustice, because he knew that any sign of anger or resistance could be interpreted as a threat. The worst thing she could do at this moment was lose her composure. However, it was nearly impossible not to feel the fury burning inside her. She hadn't done anything wrong. All she had done that day was celebrate her success, feel proud of herself, and now all of that was being overshadowed by the humiliation of being treated like a criminal. She took a deep breath, trying to control her anger, while watching Officer David, who still held that cold, arrogant expression that showed he wasn't seeing her, he was only seeing the stereotype his mind had already built. As he walked around the car, checking every inch as if he was expecting to find something incriminating, Isabella couldn't help but remember moments from her childhood. Like when, in a department store, as just a little girl, a saleswoman had followed her down every aisle, clearly assuming she was there to steal. Or the times at school when her classmates, and even some teachers, had looked at her with skepticism when she got the best grades, as if they didn't expect someone like her to excel academically. But this moment, here, on the street, surpassed everything she had experienced before. This was a direct attack on her dignity. Officer David finished inspecting the car and stepped away, pulling out his radio to call for backup. Isabella felt a chill run down her spine. She knew this would only make things worse. More police meant more eyes, more suspicious stares, more voices uninterested in hearing her side of the story. She knew that no matter how many times she said that the car belonged to her father, Commander Miguel, a black man who had worked tirelessly to rise through the ranks of the police force, they wouldn't listen. In David's eyes, she wasn't the daughter of a respected man. She was just a young black woman driving a car that, in his view, she shouldn't have been driving. Within minutes, a second patrol car arrived. The two officers who got out weren't as imposing as David, but their arrival heightened the tension in the air. They approached slowly, and though their gazes weren't as severe as the first officers, there was no compassion in them. They simply observed her, in the same way someone might look at a person caught in a minor offense, without considering the truth of the situation. They spoke quietly with David, reviewing the documents he had handed them. Every minute that passed, the anxiety in Isabella's chest grew. She knew she was trapped in a situation that made no sense, but from which there seemed to be no escape. Finally, one of the new officers, a younger man with a face that appeared calm yet indifferent, approached her. "It seems there's an issue with the registration of this vehicle. We need to take you to the station to clear some things up." Those words hit Isabella like a bucket of cold water. She was paralyzed with disbelief for a second. Take her to the station? Why? Everything was in order. The car was legal, the papers were correct, her license was valid. Why was she being treated like a criminal? Her mind searched for answers, but the only thing she found was the harsh reality of discrimination. Because she was black. That was the only reason she was being treated this way. Isabella, trying not to let panic or anger take over, spoke again, this time with more firmness. "This car belongs to my father. He's Commander Miguel, chief of police in this city. If you call him, he can clear this up immediately." Her voice sounded strong, though inside she was trembling. She knew her father would be furious when he found out what was happening, and she trusted that would stop this unjust process. But once again, her words fell on deaf ears. The young officer exchanged a quick glance with David, who merely raised an indifferent eyebrow, as if what Isabella had just said meant nothing. David was next to approach her. His face reflected a mix of impatience and superiority. It didn't matter what Isabella said, he had already made up his mind about the truth. And in his version, she was guilty. Without warning, he grabbed her arm firmly and turned her, forcing her back to face him. The sound of metal clicking as the handcuffs opened filled the air, a sound Isabella had heard many times in the stories her father told her about his work. She never thought that sound would be associated with her. But there she was, with her hands awkwardly placed behind her back, feeling the cold metal tighten around her wrists. At that moment, something inside her broke. It wasn't just the humiliation of being handcuffed in broad daylight. It went deeper than that. It was the accumulated fury of years of small injustices, of racist stares, of veiled comments about her abilities, of the unfair expectations that had always been placed on her. And now, this officer was confirming her worst fears, that no matter how hard she worked, no matter how many achievements she earned, she would still be seen first as a black woman, and as David escorted her toward the patrol car, the crowd that had gathered to watch the spectacle grew. Isabella lowered her gaze, trying not to look at the expressions on people's faces. She knew what they were thinking. She knew that for many of them, this only confirmed their own prejudices. A young black woman handcuffed on the street. The context didn't matter, the truth didn't matter. For them, the scene was already defined. Isabella, a strong, educated woman who had been accepted into one of the best law schools that very day, was being reduced to a criminal simply for existing in a space where, according to some, she didn't belong. Ly after as anything else. Her perfect day had been destroyed. The doors of the patrol car slammed shut behind Isabella, the metallic sound echoing in her mind. The back seat of the vehicle was uncomfortable and cramped, designed to make anyone sitting there feel like they didn't belong. Isabella, with her wrists still tightly bound by the cold handcuffs, tried to process what was happening. Every breath she took felt heavy, as though an enormous pressure was building in her chest. It wasn't just the humiliation of being unjustly handcuffed in front of dozens of curious onlookers, it was the sense of powerlessness that now consumed her. She had faced many adversities in her life, but she had never felt so vulnerable, so stripped of her dignity. From the back seat, through the window, she could see the officers gathered around her car. David continued speaking with his colleagues, reviewing the papers again and again, desperately searching for some reason to justify his actions. The arrogance in his body language made it clear that he wasn't willing to admit he had made a mistake. For him, he had already made up his mind about Isabella the moment he saw her driving that car. And in his mind, that decision was irreversible. Doubt wasn't part of his approach, especially when it came to a young black woman like her. Isabella, with her face pressed against the window of the patrol car, watched the scene unfold without being able to do anything. The anger began to boil inside her. The injustice of the situation burned her, but her father's warning, always present in her mind, kept her steady. She knew that although she wanted to scream and defend herself, any display of frustration could be misinterpreted. She knew that black women were too easily labeled as aggressive or troublesome. But how could she remain calm when everything that was happening wasn't just unjust but deeply humiliating? In the midst of her distress, Isabella noticed movement that caught her attention. Another patrol car was approaching. At first, she didn't pay much attention, assuming it was just another group of officers coming to observe the situation. But when the car stopped and the driver's door opened, Isabella felt a mix of relief and tension upon seeing who stepped out of the vehicle. It was her father, Commander Miguel. Miguel, a tall and strong man with dark skin and eyes filled with determination, wore an expression that Isabella recognized immediately: controlled anger. She knew her father was a man of principles, someone who had fought for decades against discrimination and racism, both within and outside the police department. But seeing him at that moment, confronting the reality that his own daughter had become a victim of the same system he had tried to reform, filled him with a fury he could barely contain. Miguel walked with firm strides toward David, who, upon seeing him, immediately changed his demeanor. The arrogance that David had displayed up until that moment vanished as soon as he recognized the man approaching him. He knew who Commander Miguel was. Everyone in the department knew him. He was respected not just for his rank but for his integrity. But in this moment, the tension was undeniable. It was clear that David wasn't used to being confronted, let alone by someone with Miguel's authority. "What the hell is going on here, officer?" Miguel demanded, his voice low but brimming with contained rage. His dark, piercing eyes locked onto David, waiting for an explanation. For the first time since all of this had started, David seemed to falter. He no longer had control of the situation. He knew it, and it made him deeply uncomfortable. He tried to maintain his firm stance, but it was clear that Miguel's presence unnerved him. "Commander Miguel." "I didn't know that," David began to say, but Miguel cut him off before he could justify his actions. "My daughter called me half an hour ago. Do you want to explain to me why she's handcuffed in the back of a patrol car like she's a criminal?" Miguel's voice remained measured, but each word was infused with an intensity that couldn't be ignored. He knew that any other reaction could be used against him, but he also knew he couldn't remain silent. David swallowed hard, clearly searching for the right words to get out of the situation he had put himself in. But nothing he could say would change the facts. He had stopped a young black woman without cause, and now he was face to face with her superior, who happened to be her father. The tension in the air was thick, almost palpable. "Sir, there were reports of stolen vehicles in the area," her car matched the description, and... "Reports of what?" Miguel interrupted again, stepping closer. "You know very well this car belongs to my family. Every officer in this city knows that. So, do you want to tell me why you really stopped her?" David, feeling the pressure building, tried to keep his composure. "I was just following protocol, sir. She didn't have identification that could verify her relationship to the vehicle's owner at the time." Miguel looked at him with a mix of disbelief and anger. "Protocol? Handcuffing my daughter and humiliating her in the street is part of your protocol?" The words came out with such force that David took a step back, visibly uncomfortable. Isabella, from inside the patrol car, watched the scene unfold with her heart racing. Seeing her father confront David gave her a sense of relief, but she also knew that this situation wouldn't be resolved easily. Her father, though powerful, couldn't change the deeply ingrained mentality of many officers in his own department. She knew the fight didn't end here. "Commander, I assure you it wasn't my intention." David tried to de-escalate the situation, but Miguel cut him off once more, his patience clearly exhausted. "I don't care about your intention, officer. What I care about is how you treat citizens, how you treat my daughter." He paused, looking around, noticing the stares of the other officers present, watching the confrontation. "This department has serious problems. And if you're a reflection of what's wrong here, I promise you things are going to change." Miguel's words were more than just a warning. They were a promise. David, who had tried to maintain his authority up until now, realized that the situation was completely out of his control. He had underestimated the power and influence of Miguel, and now he was facing the consequences of his arrogance. Miguel walked over to the patrol car and firmly opened the door. With a single gesture, he indicated to one of the other officers to remove the handcuffs from Isabella's wrists. The silence was overwhelming as the officers quickly obeyed. When she finally stepped out of the patrol car, Miguel hugged her tightly without saying a word. He knew that at that moment, words couldn't heal what had just happened. But his presence, his strength, were enough to remind Isabella that she wasn't alone. The glances exchanged between the officers and David were telling. They knew that something was about to change within that department. The tension in the air was so thick, it felt suffocating. Isabella, with her wrists still sore from the handcuffs that had just been removed, stood by her father, feeling a mixture of relief and humiliation. Miguel's protective embrace had been a temporary balm for her pain, but it couldn't erase what had just transpired. As she tried to regain control of her emotions, Miguel, the respected commander, kept his gaze fixed on David, the officer who had turned her day of celebration into a nightmare. The silence among the gathered police officers grew more uncomfortable with each passing second. Everyone knew who Miguel was. In the police department, his name was synonymous with integrity, with a constant fight for justice in a system that often ignored the most vulnerable. He was a man who had earned his position not through favors but through hard work and dedication. Every step he took toward David in that moment echoed as a declaration that this situation would not be easily forgotten. Miguel took a deep breath, trying to contain the rage burning inside him. He could see the nervousness in David's eyes but could also sense the officer's underlying resistance. This man wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by someone he didn't consider his equal. But Miguel wasn't going to let this slide. What David had done to his daughter wasn't just an administrative error or a misunderstanding. It was the culmination of years of racial prejudice, deeply embedded in the police system, that allowed officers like David to feel entitled to treat black people as automatic suspects. He stepped even closer to David, keeping his eyes locked on his. The weight of his authority filled the space, making the other officers stand still, watching silently, aware that something monumental was happening before them. With a controlled, yet heavy voice, Miguel asked what real justification David had for stopping his daughter, handcuffing her, and subjecting her to such public humiliation. He wasn't asking for a technical response. Miguel knew every law and procedure better than anyone in that scene. No, he was demanding the truth David was not ready to admit. The officer had acted based on a racial bias, on a racist assumption that had no place anywhere, least of all in a force meant to protect and serve the community. David hesitated for a moment, trying to stammer an excuse about stolen vehicles and matching descriptions, but his words crumbled under the weight of Miguel's presence. The excuse of the reports was nothing more than a facade to cover the real reason. He had seen a young black woman driving a car that, in his mind, she shouldn't have been driving. That was it. And now, under the scrutiny of a superior he couldn't manipulate or intimidate, David began to realize the gravity of his mistake. Miguel stepped even closer, keeping a distance that made David visibly uncomfortable, but without crossing the physical line. He didn't need to touch him to make David feel the weight of his wrongdoing. His voice, though low, was firm and carried the authority of a man who had faced injustices his whole life. He asked again, without leaving room for any more excuses, if David truly believed that handcuffing a black woman, based solely on a vague and unfounded suspicion, was an appropriate use of his power as a law enforcement officer. David tried to maintain his composure, but his gaze began to shift. He knew the situation was spiraling out of his control. He wasn't a rookie officer, and he knew the rules. But more than that, he understood the internal politics of the department. While he had made mistakes in the past, he had never had to face something like this. He had never been held accountable so directly and publicly by someone like Miguel. David's words became more awkward with each attempt to justify the unjustifiable. He knew that what he had done wasn't backed by any real procedure. But he also knew that in a different context, far from the gaze of someone like Miguel, his actions might have gone unnoticed or been brushed off as a minor misunderstanding. However, now there was no easy way out. The eyes of his colleagues were on him, some with sympathy, others with judgment, but none dared to intervene. Meanwhile, Isabella watched the scene unfold with a mixture of emotions. Seeing her father, her protector and role model, take control of the situation gave her some comfort. But the anger hadn't disappeared. It was still there, simmering beneath her skin. The damage had been done. She had been humiliated and treated like a criminal simply for being black and driving a car that didn't fit the image David had in his mind of someone like her. And though her father was there to defend her, Isabella knew that this was just one example of a much deeper problem. Miguel paused, allowing the silence to settle once again. Then, without breaking eye contact with David, he reminded him, in clear and unmistakable terms, that his daughter wasn't just an innocent young woman he had stopped by mistake, she was a person with rights, a citizen of this city, and above all, a human being deserving of respect. Each word he spoke seemed to weigh heavier than the last. The other officers shifted uncomfortably, aware that the situation had escalated far beyond what they had anticipated. Isabella, her arms still aching from the handcuffs, watched her father speak, but she also felt the discomfort among the other officers. She couldn't help but wonder how many of them shared David's prejudices, how many would have acted the same way if they had been in his shoes. This wasn't just a problem with one police officer, or one traffic stop. It was a structural issue, a system that allowed situations like this to be the norm, not the except. Finally, Miguel demanded that David return his daughter's belongings, including the car keys, which the officer still held. At first, David was hesitant, as if handing over the keys would mean relinquishing the last bit of control he had in the situation. But under Miguel's unyielding gaze, he had no choice but to return them. The sound of the keys landing in Isabella's hands felt like a small victory, a reminder that, while this battle had been hard, she hadn't lost it entirely. Time. Miguel turned to Isabella, with a look that conveyed both love and regret for not having been there sooner, and gestured for her to get into the car. He knew that, in that moment, the best thing was to get her away from this toxic environment. But before they left, he turned back to David. He reminded him, in no uncertain terms, that this wouldn't end here. His words were a clear warning: there would be consequences. As Isabella got back into the car, she felt her anger mix with a sense of relief. She knew her father would fight for her, that he wouldn't let this be swept under the rug. But she also knew that her fight wasn't over. This was just the beginning of a much larger battle, one that involved not just David, but an entire system that needed to change from its roots. Miguel got into the car, started the engine, and they drove away. But in the rearview mirror, Isabella could see the faces of the officers still standing on the street, most of them silent, with expressions of discomfort and fear. They knew this incident wouldn't be easily forgotten. They knew that Miguel, the commander who had spent his life fighting for a just police force, wouldn't let this fade away as just another abuse of power. They knew that things were about to change, and that truth deeply unsettled them. Isabella closed her eyes for a moment, letting the soft hum of the engine calm her. Although the fight wasn't over, she knew she wasn't alone in it. The car moved quietly through the streets, but inside the vehicle, the emotions of both Isabella and Miguel were like a storm constantly brewing. Though they both remained silent, the tension they shared was obvious. Isabella stared out the window, watching the city pass by, but her mind was trapped in the recent events. Her hands still trembled slightly, a reminder of the cold metal of the handcuffs that had tightened around her wrists. She had never experienced a humiliation like that, and even though her father had come to her rescue, the pain and anger lingered. She knew this wasn't something she could forget easily. Miguel, as he drove, kept his eyes fixed on the road, but his mind was also elsewhere. He was a man who had always valued justice, who had dedicated his life to improving a system he knew was deeply flawed. Being black and holding a position of power within an institution like the police hadn't been easy. He had fought for every promotion, faced discrimination and challenges at every turn, but he had always maintained his dignity. Now, that same system had targeted his daughter, his blood. And that filled him with a rage he could barely control. Finally, after several minutes of heavy silence, Miguel spoke, his voice low but filled with the weight of what he was feeling. "This isn't going to end like this, Isabella." Isabella, still staring out the window, nodded slowly. She knew her father was already planning his next move. He wasn't someone who would let injustice slide without consequences. But deep down, Isabella also knew that no matter what her father did, he couldn't erase what had happened. What she had felt being handcuffed, being looked at like a criminal, was something that would stay with her forever. Racism wasn't new to her. She had faced it before, at school, in stores, in other moments of her life. But this incident had been different. She had felt the full weight of a system that saw her as less, and that was a kind of pain that was hard to overcome. Miguel, however, was already determined. He knew that Officer David couldn't get away with this, and not just because of what he had done to Isabella, but because of what he represented. This was a symptom of a larger problem, one that Miguel himself had been trying to change from within the department. But he knew that racism, discrimination, and prejudice were like deep roots in that system, hard to uproot. This time, however, he had the chance to do more than fight those evils in isolation. This time, the case was personal. That night, after arriving home and ensuring Isabella was safe, Miguel immediately began taking action. First, he contacted the higher-ups in the police department. He wasn't a man of empty threats, and he knew that for change to happen, he had to act quickly. This wasn't just about seeking justice for his daughter, it was about exposing a structural problem that affected many people every day, without anyone to defend them. He knew this was the moment to use all the power and influence he had accumulated in his career to force real change. At the station, word of what had happened spread like wildfire. Every officer knew what had transpired with David and the Commander Miguel's daughter. There was a tense atmosphere in the air, a sense of anticipation among the officers, some of whom sympathized with David, while others, who knew Miguel better, realized that the consequences would be severe. David, for his part, tried to stay calm, but anxiety gnawed at him. He knew he had made a mistake, one that couldn't be fixed with simple apologies. Since the incident, he had replayed his decisions over and over in his mind, trying to justify his actions. But the truth was clear even to him: he had acted out of prejudice. He had seen a young black woman in a luxury car and assumed the worst. And now, the weight of his decisions was crushing him. Miguel arrived at the station early the next morning. His face was marked with unwavering determination. As he walked down the hallways, officers looked at him with respect, but also with a certain unease. They knew that what he was about to do would have significant repercussions. This wasn't just a man defending his daughter, this was a commander about to dismantle a culture of abuse that had remained untouched for far too long. When he entered the police chief's office, Miguel wasted no time laying out what had occurred. He left no detail out. There was clear evidence of David's misconduct, from the lack of legitimate reason for stopping Isabella to the excessive use of force in handcuffing her without cause. Miguel knew he couldn't let this incident pass as a simple misunderstanding. David needed to face the consequences of his actions, but beyond that, the police department had to change in a meaningful way. The police chief, an older white man who had worked alongside Miguel for years, listened in silence, fully aware of the gravity of the situation. He knew that, in the past, many things had been swept under the rug, but this time was different. Miguel wasn't going to let this be covered up. He knew that it was time to confront the uncomfortable realities of racism within his own department. Miguel demanded an immediate internal investigation into David's behavior. This wasn't just a personal matter, it was a matter of justice. And beyond that, he insisted on urgent reforms in the training of officers to ensure that cases of abuse and discrimination like this wouldn't happen again. He had been waiting for the opportunity to make these changes for years, and now, with his own experience as the father of a victim, he was more determined than ever. The police chief had no choice but to accept Miguel's demands. He knew there was no way to avoid the storm that was brewing. Isabella's case, backed by her father's reputation and power, was only the catalyst for a larger change that Miguel had been seeking throughout his career. That same morning, the department publicly announced that an internal investigation into the incident with Officer David would be conducted. The local media, always hungry for controversies within law enforcement, quickly picked up the story. External pressure began to mount, and soon, the incident became a topic of conversation throughout the city. This wasn't just about Commander Miguel's daughter anymore, it was about how the police treated black people in general. Isabella, from home, watched everything unfold through the news. Seeing her father take action filled her with pride, but also with a deep sadness. She knew that while he was fighting for her, her experience couldn't be erased. What she had felt being handcuffed on that street, in front of judging eyes, was something she would carry with her forever. But she also knew that her father was fighting for something bigger, for all the people who, like her, had been treated unjustly and had no one to defend them. Miguel had intervened decisively. But he knew this fight was far from over. His daughter's case was just the beginning of a much longer battle, one that would require deep and painful changes in an institution that had resisted reform for far too long. The hallways of the station were filled with a dense atmosphere, laden with discomfort and anticipation. The news of Miguel's intervention had spread like wildfire. Every officer knew that things couldn't continue as they had. Murmurs intertwined in low conversations, with some defending Officer David, seeing him as the victim of disproportionate punishment, while others remained silent, fully aware that Commander Miguel was right in demanding justice. A fracture was becoming increasingly visible. Miguel walked into the station every day with the same imposing stature as always, but now there was a difference. The looks directed at him were not just of respect but also of nervousness. Everyone knew that he had initiated a process that had no turning back, a process that would expose the deep cracks in the institution. Every step he took was watched closely, and his presence served as a constant reminder that change was underway. David, the epicenter of all this tension, had been temporarily suspended while the investigation continued. For him, the pressure was unbearable. He had imagined that his mistake would be minimized, that things would be resolved as they had so many times before for other officers in similar situations. But he hadn't anticipated that the person he had wronged was the daughter of someone with such power within the force. He knew he was under everyone's scrutiny, and that his career hung by a thread. Every time he went to the station to sign the required documents for the investigation, his colleagues' eyes followed him. Some looked at him with pity, others with disapproval, but everyone knew that he had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. Deep down, David wasn't an entirely malicious man, but he was the product of a system that had allowed him to act without question for years. He had seen black men and women detained, arrested, and humiliated without consequence. He had learned to see people like Isabella through a lens distorted by prejudice. Now, facing the consequences of his actions, he was forced to reflect on his behavior, something he had never done before. But he still wasn't ready to admit the truth. The day Miguel was called to a key meeting with the department's top brass, the tension was at its peak. The time had come for important decisions to be made, and David's fate, along with the future of the department, hung in the balance. As Miguel entered the conference room, he noticed the stiff faces of those present, the police chief, some captains, and high-ranking officers. Though formalities were maintained, the discomfort was palpable. They knew Miguel wouldn't accept easy compromises. The conversation began with the police chief acknowledging the severity of the incident and assuring that a fair investigation was underway. However, Miguel wasn't swayed by empty promises. He knew that, historically, investigations like this ended in mild reprimands or were swept under the rug, especially when the officers involved were white. His daughter, Isabella, wouldn't be just another statistic in that trend. She couldn't be just another name suffering in silence while the mechanisms of institutional racism remained intact. With a firm and controlled voice, Miguel laid out what had happened, point by point. He left no room for doubt. He detailed how David had stopped Isabella without reasonable cause, how he had decided to handcuff her before even verifying the car's ownership, and how all of this wasn't an isolated case but part of a systemic problem. His voice filled the room, reaching every corner with an undeniable truth. This wasn't just about his daughter but about a culture of impunity that had to end. The other officers present listened in silence, some of them with tense expressions, fully aware that Miguel was pointing out something they, too, knew but preferred not to discuss. They knew that racism within the department was a problem they had ignored for far too long. And while not all of them shared David's prejudices, many had been complicit through their silence. They knew they had turned a blind eye when injustices were committed, that they had allowed officers like David to operate under an unofficial layer of protection. After listening to Miguel, the police chief cautiously took the floor. He knew he couldn't ignore what Miguel had presented, but he also felt the pressure from those within the department who didn't want to see radical changes. At its core, police culture resisted change. The chief acknowledged that David's conduct had been inappropriate and confirmed that the investigation would continue, but Miguel wouldn't be satisfied with just that. Miguel knew that a simple investigation would not be enough. During the meeting, he made it clear that the reforms could not be limited solely to punishing David, they had to go much further. He proposed immediate changes to officer training, focusing on racial awareness and how to treat people fairly, regardless of skin color or social class. Additionally, he demanded a more rigorous supervision system to identify and eliminate patterns of racist behavior among officers before incidents like the one his daughter had experienced could occur. The chief of police shifted uncomfortably in his chair, knowing that what Miguel was asking for wouldn't be easy to implement. Changing a department so deeply rooted in its traditions meant facing internal resistance, not only from the officers but also from the police unions, which often protected their members regardless of how wrong they might be. However, Miguel did not back down. He wasn't willing to let this opportunity slip away. He knew that if he didn't act now, the same problems that had affected his daughter would continue to impact other Black, Latino, and marginalized youth in the city. This was his moment to make a difference, not just for Isabella but for all those who didn't have the powerful voice he had to defend themselves. The chief of police finally agreed to implement some of the reforms Miguel suggested, though he did so cautiously, choosing his words carefully. He knew he couldn't fully refuse without facing public backlash, especially with the level of attention the case had drawn in the local media. But he also understood that real change would take time, more time than anyone in the room wanted to admit. When the meeting ended, Miguel left the office with the feeling of having won a battle, but he was aware that the war would be much longer. He knew that his fight for justice would not end with David's sanctions or the implementation of new training programs. The true battle was changing the mindset of the officers, the department's leaders, and, ultimately, a society that had learned to accept these injustices as part of everyday life. In the following days, tension in the police department increased. Many officers were uncomfortable with the new supervisory measures and training, seeing the reforms as a direct attack on their work. Others, however, supported the changes, recognizing that Isabella's incident had revealed systemic flaws that could no longer be ignored. Miguel remained firm, committed to his mission of eradicating racism from the institution at its roots. But beyond the department, the city also began to change. Isabella's story and her confrontation with Officer David had resonated within the community, especially among those who had suffered in silence for so long. Black men and women who had been unjustly profiled and mistreated by the police began to raise their voices, inspired by Miguel's example. What had started as an isolated incident was becoming a broader movement for racial justice in the city. Isabella, for her part, was still processing what had happened. She knew her life would never be the same, but she also understood that her father was fighting for something bigger. And in that fight, she found new strength. The atmosphere in the police department had become unbearable for David. Though he remained suspended as the investigation progressed, the feeling of being watched, judged, and, in some cases, even defended surrounded him like a dark cloud. For a man accustomed to exercising power without restrictions, imposing his authority without being questioned, this situation was new, and it sank him into discomfort he didn't know how to handle. But something else was beginning to eat away at him from within, a growing awareness that perhaps, just perhaps, he was part of the problem. During the first few days of his suspension, David tried to justify his actions, telling himself that he had followed protocol, that he was just doing his job. But those justifications began to sound hollow, even to him. Deep down, he knew that he had stopped Isabella because of the color of her skin. He had known it from the moment he saw her behind the wheel of the SUV, when something deeply ingrained inside him told him that this young woman didn't belong in that car. And now, as the walls seemed to close in around him, that truth was becoming harder, and he had tried to avoid self-reflection, blaming the environment and the media frenzy the case had caused. But something about the way Commander Miguel confronted him that day, something about the look in Isabella's eyes, had deeply shaken him. He knew he was wrong. But accepting that truth meant much more than acknowledging a mistake. It meant confronting years of thoughts and attitudes he had taken for granted. It meant facing himself and admitting that his view of the world, and of black people, was distorted by prejudices he didn't even know he had. One afternoon, during his suspension, David found himself at home, sitting alone at his small desk. Scattered around him were papers from the case, reports, transcripts, documents that were now part of the ongoing investigation. But his gaze wasn't fixed on those papers, it was on something deeper, his own story, his own conditioning. He recalled his early years at the academy, when he had learned from veteran officers who always seemed to distrust certain groups, making casual comments, sometimes veiled, sometimes direct, about black or Latino people. David had been young and easily influenced. He had absorbed those comments and attitudes without questioning them, believing they simply reflected the reality of the job. Racism wasn't something openly discussed in the department, but it was there. Subtle, often disguised as jokes or offhand comments, but present. And David had immersed himself in that culture without ever stopping to ask if what he thought or felt was truly justified. Now, in the midst of the crisis he had provoked, he was beginning to realize how that culture had shaped his professional and personal life. Miguel, for his part, continued his fight, knowing he had won a battle, but the real transformation would require time and continuous effort. That night, when he returned home, he found Isabella waiting for him in the living room. She had been studying, but when she saw her father walk in, she set her books aside and looked at him with a mix of pride and tenderness. "Everything okay, Dad?" she asked. Miguel nodded and sat down next to her. "We're making progress," he replied. "It's not easy, but we're moving forward." Isabella gave him a soft smile, knowing that her father's words spoke not only about his work but about something deeper. She understood that everything he was doing wasn't just for the department or even for her, but for all those who had been marginalized and forgotten. They sat in silence for a moment, sharing a peaceful pause before the outside world demanded their attention again. They both knew the work wasn't over. They knew that the fight for justice was ongoing. But in that moment, they could feel the weight of progress, one step closer to a future where no one would have to endure what Isabella had gone through. And that future, thanks to Miguel's tireless efforts, seemed a little bit closer. If you enjoyed this powerful and emotional story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Give it a like, share it with your friends, and comment below on what you thought about this journey for justice. Your opinion is very important to us. And don't forget to check out the video now appearing on the end screen. I'm sure you'll love it. See you next time.